Hi, y'all. My name's Cody Recker. I am currently a bookseller at Barnes & Noble in Oregon. I was formerly one of the booksellers at Novel Neighbor in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm very happy to be here to be announcing the St. Louis Teen Book Festival and to be hosting this Strange Worlds panel. Before we begin, I just wanted to give a shout out to our sponsors, which are HEC Media, the St. Louis County Library, and the Novel Neighbor. All of the books that are going to be talked about on this panel today will be available for purchase at thenovelneighbor.com. So without further ado, I'd like to announce our panelists, which are Scott Reintgen, Marie Lu, and Amie Kaufman. Thanks, guys, for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm excited to chat with everyone.
I'm excited. If you guys could all start, let's just start with Amie and go in alphabetical order. And if you guys could introduce yourself and your most recent book.
Oh man, the sudden moment of panic when you said alphabetical order, and I was like, I'm a writer for a living. Also not my problem because I'm first. So my name is Amie Kaufman. I am the author of a bunch of stuff. My most recent books are The Other Side of the Sky and Aurora Burning, which are fantasy and science fiction, which is where I create my worlds. But I'm actually really excited about Scott and Marie's worlds, of which I'm huge fans. So I just can't wait to get talking today.
Oh, well, Amie knows I am a huge fan of her work and of her as a person in general. So all of her books are amazing. If you guys haven't read her books out there, please do yourself a favor, pick them up. So my latest is Skyhunter. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer, and Skyhunter is a duology that is set about 5,000 years in the future in a regressed version of our society, and follows a girl named Talon, who is a warrior in this world, and a boy named Red, who is fighting on the other side of the war, whom she meets and isn't quite sure if she should trust this guy or not. He may be a spy, he may be a weapon of war, but he may also be the miracle that saves them all. So it's been the hardest book and the longest book I've ever had to write, but I'm really excited about it. And the sequel, Steel Striker, which was just announced, which is coming out this fall. So yeah, that's what I'm working on.
Hey everyone, my name is Scott Reintgen. So first, like, those two covers are maybe like my favorite covers. Like, those are beautiful covers, and your other covers are like pretty cool too. So like, those are two of my favorite covers of yours. I write sci-fi, I write fantasy, so the Strange Worlds fits too. I have the Nyxia Trilogy, which is kind of like Hunger Games in space, 10 teens recruited to go into space. And then the most recent one, which is a completed duology, is the Ashlords series, which follows the world of competitive Phoenix horse racing. So Phoenix horses that live and die all in one day and are reborn at sunrise, but kind of change depending on what you mix in and the alchemy you do and all that fun stuff. I tend to write, big competitions and really enjoy just sort of stepping in from our world and into anywhere else. Is a lot of fun. So.
Yay, thank you guys. If I figured we could just like ease into this a little bit and start by talking about what kind of sci-fi stuff inspires you with your writing, like whether it be books or TV shows or what have you. What is it that really sparks inspiration in you?
Oh, that's a good one. There's this quote from J.R.R. Tolkien, which I'm about to mangle for sure, where so kind of apologies in advance, but he talks about the idea of creative compost, so that, everything that you consume, whether it's like books or music or TV or, other stories or experiences or places you go, it all falls to your mental forest floor, and what grows out of it is flavored by the creative compost that you've created. And I love that because it gives me a sense that the ingredients I put in do affect the things that I write, which, comes down, we all talk all the time about how you should, read widely. And that's one of the really good reasons. But it also means that when I'm trying to get myself into a certain headspace, I can go to certain things and know that they're going to take me there. I feel like we're probably all going to have a lot of stuff in common. For me, there's a lot of kind of old school sci-fi stuff like Star Trek and stuff that's a big influence. And a bunch of new books. But my first sci-fi experience that I remember ever was when I was 11, and my dad gave me a copy of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea for Christmas, which now I look back at as an adult, I'm like, there's a lot of pages where they just list species of fish in that book. But I had been a big fantasy reader, and so I got it on the 25th, and they just didn't see me again till the 27th. And when I resurfaced, I had discovered these books where, I love fantasy. I write fantasy, but I had discovered these books where that's a story I could be in. I don't have to have magic that's out of reach or be able to do something that I can't make happen to get into it. This is a story that I could exist in, and something about that just made my brain tingle in a way I never came back from. And I think the way it has influenced me is I am very about ordinary people in stories rather than extraordinary people.
Oh, I love everything about what Amie just said, and it's so true, the compost of everything that you experience and you take in, and creativity begets creativity. And so the more that I find myself indulging other people's creativity, the more I find myself being able to produce creativity. And I think it's also why the past year has been kind of uneven for me in terms of being creative, because I haven't been able to tap into other people's creativity in a way that I usually do. So but anyway, I can remember, like Amie said, those formative moments where you discover that thing that just explodes your mind and for me, kind of changes the course of my life or my creativity in certain ways. And I remember where I was and what I was doing when I discovered those things. And when I was 11, I discovered Brian Jakes' Redwall series, and I just saw there was my librarian at school had put out a display with Madame Mayo in the display case, and there was a warrior mouse with the sword and the tunic, and I was like, what is that? I have never been exposed to fantasy or science fiction at that point. And so I checked it out and read it and just blew through all the Redwall books. It was my gateway drug to every other fantasy and then science fiction series. And so I have this very strong imprint of walking past my library's shelf, seeing that book, and then that book taking me in a direction where I was writing fantasy and science fiction and fan fiction of those fantasy and science fiction stories. And then Jacqueline Carey's Cushio's Dart series was very formative for me, probably at an age when I should not have read it yet, but that was one. And then N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth series just blew my mind, made me see different ways that you could approach writing science fiction and building science fiction worlds. And so all of these series, like Amie said, you take bits and pieces from what you learn from these writers and the worlds that they build, and it all eventually ends up in my book somewhere, whether consciously or unconsciously.
It's funny. I had a very different Redwall experience. I wrote this mice versus birds of prey. I thought it was so cool. It was a 15-page book for me in 6th grade. And then my teacher handed me Redwall in response. And I was like, no. And so I was very upset and I never read it because I was upset.
He plagiarized you.
Clearly. I thought that was clear as well. But I love the idea of the compost. I also love just that concept of, we think of writing as lonely and alone, and you go to the loneliest room in your house and you write it, and maybe one day when you die, people will read it. But it's such a natural collaboration. I say it all the time that if you like the way I end my chapters, you like the way that Ursula K. Le Guin ends her chapters. She taught me that. And if you like my action scenes, you like Pierce Brown and Marie Lou's action scenes, because that's who taught me that. And if you like how I balance point of view, I learned that from Lee Bardugo and Jay Kristoff and Amy Kaufman. So I am in collaboration. I'm looking at what other authors do and taking those tools and adding it to my tool belt. And it's why I'm more versatile as an author, because I am more widely read. I've dove into their stories. It started with video games for me, though. I was not a huge middle school reader. I didn't like reading until about 8th grade, but I was playing Asheron's Call and World of Warcraft and Halo and Call of Duty. And there were all these stories, and I would write fan fiction from them. And I think that was a real big starting point for me as a creator. Later, I would read the first 7 chapters of A Game of Thrones, which are just a masterclass in writing. They're amazing. Character, the tone he sets, the way he uses ice and fire against each other in those opening chapters, like it's gorgeous. And I remember walking away being like, oh, you can write like this. I guess I'll figure it out one day. I still haven't, but I'm working on it.
I remember that exact moment for me. I remember I was about to shy away from spoilers, but I feel like probably at this point I can say something about the start of the series anyway. I remember, like, because I was a George R.R. Martin hipster, and I remember reading book 1 when it came out and reading the person I assumed to be the main character. And then suddenly, because in every book I had ever read in my reading life, the person whose point of view I was in, whose things I had learned to care about, whose hopes and worries I followed, was the main character. And suddenly, literally, that person's dead. And I literally, I can tell you exactly where I was, like where the sun was in the sky. I was like outside on this deck, and I lowered the book and I looked up, and I consciously thought to myself, if I keep reading, I'm going to be different forever. And I didn't quite know what that meant, but I knew like something was happening. And then I was like, yeah, okay. And in I went, and it completely changed the way that I wrote. Like everyone became expendable because, and not in a bad way, but in a, it taught me like the power of like, if we really get to know you before you die.
Mm-hmm. Could you guys all run me through your like world building process and how that changes from different genres or different age categories? Because I know you all have written in various different things. Could you just talk a little bit about how you change your trajectory depending on what type of thing you're writing?
It's always a little bit different depending on the book, but in general, all of my stories have started out with a character, and this character walks into my head, sometimes fully formed, sometimes partially formed, and the world kind of grows from that character. And I start to ask myself questions about, why is Talon a warrior? Why can she not speak? Why is she ostracized from her society? And then all of those questions are the bits and pieces that I use to start building the world that grows around her. It was the same with Day and June from Legend. I knew I wanted to write about a teen criminal versus a teen detective, and I didn't know what kind of world would allow that to happen until I just started asking myself questions based on those characters. And then I kind of layer in, depending on things that I'm currently interested in, that I'm reading about in society, or things that are keeping me up at night, like all kinds of questions that form who I am as a person in that moment in time, go into the world building of that particular book. And and then it kind of changes depending on the book. Like, for example, when I was writing The Young Elites or when I was writing Skyhunter, those books kind of look back on a historical element of society. So I found myself kind of slowing my pace down, reading about how things used to be, about ancient societies. Skyhunter is set in a world where there's a lot of ruins, and there's a mystery of who used to exist and where they advanced and what did they do. And then with Warcross, it was more of like I felt the stress and the tension of my characters, because that is very near future science fiction. So the research that I did for that was very different. And it was like reading the latest article that came out and reading about the latest science fiction invention that happened and trying to make my book not be dated in 10 years. So it was a kind of a very stressful, very different way of building the world, where I had to make sure I kept on top of it and build it in such a way that it felt like it could potentially happen in 10 years. Whereas, Skyhunter is set like 5,000 years. Who knows what's happening then? We're still around. So it's very different in that sense, but for me, it always boils down to the characters first.
I think mine starts with a concept first, but I do think the story comes to life when that character crossroads. They kind of figure out, like, who are we going to follow into that concept. And I think most of my stories are all about, I think my favorite type of world building is nestling the familiar right next to the unfamiliar. Like, you really need a way for the reader to set their feet down and feel at home as they're invited into the new, right? So they get both of those feelings. They feel comfortable enough to walk forward with your character. but it's different each time. Like, and I also think some of it is like figuring out what doesn't go in, because especially when you're a new writer, you're trying to shove every cool concept into that book, and paring it away is what works. So Ashlords came out of that. I had a great set of beta readers who read my first concept, which was 4 races through 4 different dimensions, which I thought was cool, right? And every single one of them was like, hey, the Phoenix horses in the second world, those are awesome. And I'd be like, cool, what about worlds 1, 3, and 4? And they'd say, the Phoenix horses are really cool. And so I quickly knew that what to pare away, what to put the microscope on, and all of a sudden that world clicked into place. And so, it's often finding what works and doesn't work, and then just sort of figuring out how to keep those threads sort of central to the book. But a lot of that world building process also changes when like second world fantasy versus built on our world, like those involve different levels of research, kind of like Marie was saying, and one gives you certain freedoms that the other one does not.
That's so cool. I think I'm very much a world first kind of person. So, the Aurora cycle, we're in the future, we're at a space military school, there's a squad. That's all we need to know about them. What's the world like now? And what are we dropping the squad into? Other side of the sky, there's a science fiction city in the sky and a magical world below. Once I've worked that out, then Meg and I started to talk about, okay, who would be cool to meet from those worlds. But I think if you want the long answer on world building from me, I did about like podcast episodes about it on my podcast. But the short answer is I start with the one thing that's different, and everything ripples from that. Because when I try to just sort of build a world with a whole bunch of cool things that I like, it ends up like trying to put different size pieces of Lego together. They're all kind of technically the same thing, but they don't connect. And, even if it's not obvious, readers kind of know that you've Frankenstein some stuff together. So I start with one thing that's different and then work out what would ripple from it. And I mean, like, we're living in the middle of an example of that right now. You change one thing, which is you introduce like a public health threat, and here we are doing a festival on Zoom. We all know how to Zoom. We all know, what a viral load is. We all know what a swab test is. We all, we have a distance education. Like, every aspect of our lives changes because of one thing. But you can do it with anything. You can say, if suddenly planes couldn't fly anymore, then we wouldn't have any international travel, and, freight would become really slow. Everything would have to be pretty much manufactured in the country, or at least on the continent where it was used. A whole bunch of them aren't equipped to do that. So how does that change society? Ripple, 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 ripple. So I think that's how I kind of like to create a coherent world, is by finding my one big thing that changes and then letting everything come out from there. And then I go to who is interesting to tell a story in there, by which I really mean who has room to kind of change and grow and suffer in that world. Because not because I love suffering despite my rep, but because if nothing goes wrong, it's not a story, right? It's just like an anecdote about a day that more or less went to plan. You need stuff to go wrong, so who's got a lot to lose,
Yeah. Scott, you mentioned Nestling familiar with unfamiliar. I actually had a question that was about that. How do you balance doing that? How do you balance the Nestling familiar with unfamiliar, like bringing in real world stuff with other things to make it so like things aren't too complicated or is easier for the reader to get into? Any of you guys can answer this, but
yeah, take my horse racing one, right? Like, horses are familiar to us, even if they're not intimately familiar to you. Like, if you're not a horse riding person, that's cool. Like, you still know what a horse is. And that's a very familiar creature. Like, I joked about this the other day because we teach my 3-year-old animals all the time. And I'm like, we are really focusing on animals. Like, is this his future? But it's like very heavily hit in the early years. But that intimacy is this nice, nestled, safe space for the reader that you can then send us off different bridges. And so when my horse, transforms into a horse that can defy gravity, you're kind of okay with that because you know what the normal horse is doing. And it's like, oh, this is just these weird horses in Scott's universe. And so I don't know if that's like a technique, it's just something where you're trying really hard. I think certain books are allowed to go so alien and so different that we feel displaced. And that's a certain genre too. I'm not trying to write that. I'm trying to write gateway fantasy, invitation sci-fi, stuff that, like, if you've never read a sci-fi in your life, you still might want to jump into this because it feels good. And so I'm not trying to write those stories. I do think those stories have a place in our genre for sure.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting to hear, because as you hear it, I'm kind of thinking of like, oh yeah, I see moments I've done that. But, whether it's like in Aurora, well, here's a squad and they've all got set roles, and that's really easy to get your head around. That's a gang structure you're familiar with. Now but one's an alien, but one's, this, that, or the other. But I think I probably like more consciously do that kind of pinning to what's familiar via emotional stuff. Like I kind of go into I always just find the more honest I am on the page with stuff that I'm not sure about sharing, the more it connects with people, because it's the stuff that they've got that they're not sure about sharing. So, if I write about like that sense of like acute embarrassment when you realize you have just massively put your foot in it and completely offended the people around you because what you said actually was dumb, or like that moment of standing outside a room and you're like, I know I have to go in, I know I have to go in person now, but hear me out, what if I just turn around and leave? And it'll be like at least 3 hours before the consequences of that hit me, and that's a long time. So like those kind of real feelings that we don't always talk about having, I think allow people to go, okay, well, this person might be, in the middle of space, or might be a magician, or might be something quite different from me, but actually I know them. Like actually they're me as well. And I think that helps people stay connected even when we go to the weird place.
Yeah, and I think both of you do that so well in all of your stories. Both you, Scott and Amie, where I never feel lost in your stories, no matter how, huge and big the world is. I always feel grounded by these tethers that remind me of your character's humanity. And because that's, at the end of the day, we're still writing about humanity, no matter how many mirrors we hold up to our worlds, fun size mirrors, carnival mirrors, it's still about humanity. And particularly in YA, I think YA in particular has this unique window into the emotional development of our characters, because we're accessing our characters at such a formative time in their lives, and everything matters. And it doesn't matter if they are, a warrior fighting monsters, or if they're, in a horse, like an alien horse race, or if, they're in outer space. You're still like, oh my God, he touched my hand. This is the most amazing moment of my life. Or, oh my God, do they like me? Do they not? What about my parents? Like these are all kind of universal things. So I absolutely agree with everything that both of you have said.
I love that. And Cody, you caught me a little off guard with the question, but one of the things that it's one of my favorite thoughts, and I can't remember who the author is who came up with it, but it talks about like your readers carrying a book bag, and every new world building thing and every new anything feels like a little bit of weight. And if you put too much of that in without the human element, which helps them set things down or forget they're carrying that weight, things get too heavy. They set the book bag down, which means they're setting the book down. And so I think there is something about like human element that lightens the load. A cool moment, a flash of action, those things interspersed in that world building is what usually makes it so that we like this backpack. Let's keep rolling. This is a fun adventure, versus like, I feel weighed down because there's so much to learn, or there's so much I don't get that I don't feel welcome quite here yet. So I'm going to set this down and go somewhere else where I feel more comfortable.
So I have a couple questions one question for each of you guys individually. My first question is for Amie, and this is supposed to be for you and Jay, but we got it. We're good. I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about how writing series with a co-author, how that evolved over writing multiple series with them, or how your world building kind of changes throughout all of that, and how an evolution. Is there an evolution or anything like that?
That's a really good question, because, we get asked all the time what it's like to write together, but we're rarely asked, or I don't know if we've ever been asked whether it really changes. And I mean, I think the main answer is that we've just gotten much more comfortable with each other. Like, we were probably a little more polite at first because, you know, we had known each other like less than a year when we decided to write a series together. And we never thought Illuminae would sell in a million years because, like, I don't know if you've seen the inside of this thing, but like, we just thought that there was like a 95% chance that publishers would look at it and say, I have never seen anything like this and I do not know what it is. And that there was like a 5% chance they would say, I've never seen anything like it. I don't know what it is. So thankfully for us, we hit the latter. But I think at the beginning, we were just being silly and having fun and writing to entertain each other. And then we suddenly sold a book and had to work together, and we like became a bit more profesh. And then we just spent, when you add it all up, just like months on tour together, and we got very cash again really quick because I think, you know, you can't spend that much time with someone without just kind of becoming family. And I think, funnily enough, I think we kind of ended up circling back to where we began, which is now when I sit down to write a chapter in something I'm writing with Jay, what I'm writing it for him. I'm writing it to make him laugh, and I'm writing it to make him go, what? And I'm writing for his reactions. And I mean, the thing is, every writer will tell you the more specific you are in the audience, somehow the more universal you actually are.
Scott, my question for you is, Ashlords has 3 different point of views, and one of them is in second person. How did writing in second person come about, and how would you ever do it again?
It's such an interesting thing. I think the decision, like, I'm really proud of how I wrote that. And yet the response to it, I like read my Goodreads pretty closely. And so I've gotten to see sort of some of the, I cannot tell you how many times I got like a 4-star review that was like, this novel's perfect. I didn't like the second person. I'm like, okay, cool. And so the decision there was the funny thing too, is that I get a lot of people who are like, don't know why he did this. And I'm like, I promise I did it on purpose. So for Pippa in particular, she is the daughter of 2 former champions. So her mom won this big horse race. Her dad won this big horse race. She's expected to win it. She's someone everyone knows in the entire empire. She's, Kardashian, a famous person who any like name recognition is automatic. And she sees herself that way. She sees herself almost at a distance as a brand. And so when she's kind of looking from the backdrop, it's almost like she's controlling her actions. She's saying, you should do this, you should do this, you should do this. And so it was very deliberate. It was something that I very intentionally tried to roll out. It was difficult to write that way because it's a huge learning curve. It's not natural. I did learn a lot of what I did from N.K. Jemisin, who I think, people weren't as pleased with mine, but N.K. Jemison's is like flawless second person. If you want to take a master class in writing second person, she does it perfectly. But I think there's something about those choices that are rooted in who you are as an artist. And I chose that with great care, and I wrote it that way with great care. So I'm always like, I probably won't do it again, but it's something that fit that character pretty perfectly. And then it allowed me to do something like nothing news under the sun, right? We write in the footsteps of our favorite books, and we're often taking an old concept and writing it with our new voice, and what makes it unique is us, right? The writer ourselves. But in this book, I did something that I've never seen done, ever. And it was the only time I've ever done anything like that. And it was the second person that allowed me to do it. And it's a plot twist that I have already had so many readers email me about and just be like, you jerk. And it's fun though. And so I think it's like anything, you're playing with a new tool, and you, as long as you're using it the right way, it should be something that you feel like you can do if you want to do it.
Marie, my question for you is about militarization. A lot of your books have to do with militaries or strong, like, I don't know, I just feel like I've noticed it frequently about the cross between like technology and military and how power can be misused. Could you just talk a bit about why that's such a frequent thing in your writing, maybe?
Yeah, for sure. It's funny how when in the process of writing my books, I don't see these patterns that are emerging in my stories. And it's not until I look back and I'm like, oh, I am doing this over and over and over. There is something about this that is in my psyche. And so with militarization, with technology, I think both of those things are just things that I find myself constantly fascinated and terrified and disturbed by. And, you know, I grew up in China. I came to the States when I was 5, and it was the year 1989 when I came over. And my family and I lived in Beijing and lived like a couple blocks away from Tiananmen Square, not a couple blocks, a couple miles away from Tiananmen Square. And I remember, you know, I was really young. I was too young to understand what was happening out there. But I remember the year 1989 and that whole spring, seeing these young people out in the square. There were like 100,000 of them just protesting. And we would go out to the square all the time because it was kind of like a, you know, local tourist attraction. You go there, you see the parks, and you know, eat popsicles and stuff. And I would go there for the popsicles. There was always like a little popsicle man. And I remember seeing those crowds and them erecting this giant white Statue of Liberty in that square. And I remember the soldiers, you know, the police are always out there. And I remember the day that the Tiananmen Square massacre happened, and we had gone out to the square, and I usually went with my cousin who was a year older than me. And my aunt wouldn't let him go because he was 6 and he refused to take off his bright red overalls. And my aunt is like, no, revolutionary color, take it off. And he's like, absolutely not. So he had to stay home. I went by myself with my aunt. And I remember that day being different because there were tanks out in the square, and they were all kind of at the entrances and exits of the square, just kind of waiting for orders from the government. And I remember my aunt leaning down to me and saying, this is not a good day to be out in the square. Like, we should go home now. And so I'm sure I protested a little bit. I went back with my aunt. Didn't hear anything that night, but the next day I remember school was canceled all throughout Beijing and probably throughout China. And I didn't really understand what that was until I moved to the States and, you know, could read more about it, because you really can't find information about it in China. But that image of the tanks always stayed with me, I think, and it kind of has delved deeper into my psyche than I was aware of. So there's a very specific scene that shows up in legend that is directly inspired by Tiananmen Square, and I find myself going back constantly to think about the military and politics and how our societies are built up and and crumble based on what happens with politics and with militarization. And it's the same with technology. I think I have like a similar kind of fascination with technology. I remember when I was writing Warcross, just seeing all of the changes that were happening in our world and how they're happening faster and faster. And on the one hand, it's really cool. We get all of these cool things. Technology has done wonders for society. And then at the same time, feeling this unease of, you know, are we always 2 steps? Is our morality always 2 steps behind, you know, our technology? Like, and why does it have to be that way? And so these are all kind of questions that keep me awake at night and kind of haunt me. So I find myself repeatedly going back through them, and militarization and technology are always tied together, you know, and as technology grows and changes, so does the way that we militarize them. And so I find myself asking these questions over and over again in different iterations in my stories. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much for joining me and for making this a wonderful time.